Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third and final part of the History of French Valley series. In this section, we're going to be going over the history between the years 1950 to 2000. Now, you'll notice that this is titled Part 1. That's because Part 2 is still in the process of being built here at the French Valley Library. We're going to try to present you with a digital and physical archive of French Valley's numerous historical documents, historical artifacts, and the like. And we're very excited to bring that to you, and you will be given regular updates as to when that will be presented. So going forward, we're going to go ahead and look at the period of time after the Second World War and right up to the year 2000. Now, the difference between this presentation and the last is that as you go forward in history, the prevalence of artifacts, the prevalence of photographs, personal photographs, becomes very limited. And that's because obviously as we move forward, history becomes thought of less as history and more as things that are just known to the common person at the time. So some of the pictures you'll see in here are not necessarily of French Valley in itself, but they are taken around the same time and they accurately illustrate the types of things that we're going to be talking about as we go through these decades. So we're going to be starting off in the 1950s. The 50s was a very unique period of time as it took place directly after the end of the Second World War, and it was seen by many as a golden age for the United States. Obviously, we had left the Great Depression behind, with wartime production getting us staunchly out of that depression. And we were now grappling with exactly what America was to be. There were new problems that we had to face. There was a new enemy that we saw in the face of the Russians. And while that was on a global scale, all of that stuff actually did trickle down into French Valley, and it affected our residents in a very profound way. So what you see here are examples of things that changed in the 1950s. We have major social changes happening with the implementation of the civil rights movement. You also had changes in technology, changes in ideology. And for many, America was a very changed place from the end of World War II in 1945 till now. Obviously, people were getting paid much more than they were. The depression wasn't as prevalent as it was. There were still people having hard times, but for the most part, Americans found a way out of that. Jobs were more abundant in the 1950s. Things were a little bit cheaper. Your dollar went a little bit further. But at the same time, we still had significant issues to deal with, whether that be, as I said before, with civil rights, whether that be with fair wages, as you see in the picture on the bottom center of your screen. And America had a lot of things to deal with at the time. And while, as I said before, these are more global issues that it had to deal with, they're bigger than just a small town or what have you. They did trickle down into French Valley, and the residents of French Valley did have to deal with them. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is post-war America and a new threat, as the slide is titled. Now, talking about something that is global, the end of World War II brought with it a new question, and that question was, who was the major enemy? For many people, both in the military and outside the military, we saw it as the Soviet Union. The Soviets were economically and ideologically opposite of America, and therefore we had a lot of things that came into conflict with the Soviet Union, and those things were brought about also in conversations that were being had by the residents of French Valley. In talking with the Historical Society in French Valley, I found that the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear war, it was something that was very, very prominent on their minds. A lot of the residents of French Valley had to go through bomb drills. They had to understand that even though they were a mainly agricultural center and they were dry farmers out in a valley in California, that they could still be hit with a nuclear weapon. And they also came to realize that if the Russians were to attack, they were being told that the Russians would attempt to attack agricultural centers first. That way they would cut off our supply lines to food and things of that nature. We know this today as the Red Scare, obviously, and it is categorized by a rise in McCarthyism, a rise in global fear of the bomb, And you see in the collection of pictures here, I have a picture of a very prominent movie from Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove. The attitudes reflected in that movie are very much the attitudes that were reflected by everyday citizens in the United States. A lot of people believed that the bombs were going to fall and that they could only do what they could to try to save themselves. This ideology of the Red Scare and stuff like that was also brought about from the veterans coming home from the Second World War who had seen the ruins of Europe. They had seen the devastation that the Allied and Nazi bombing raids have had on both England and Europe as a whole. So bomb drills of hiding under desks, the implementation of fallout shelters like you see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there, those were very prevalent, even here in French Valley, even in a small farming community in Southern California. And it's something that you can tell when something is very brought into the public psyche, in the sense that it's something that these people who were children at the time, they don't forget it. It's something that stuck with them. It's something that still scares them today, even with current events being as they are here in 2022. And it's very, very interesting to see the reflection looking back and seeing what was happening in the 1950s and seeing the scared people who had to go through these bomb drills. They had to understand that the things that were happening at the time, while they were on a global scale, they could come and affect this small community here in Southern California. Now, moving on from the Red Scare and stuff like that, we're going to look at what day-to-day life looked like. And obviously the people of French Valley, they were being affected by global events and whatnot. We've already discussed that, but they were also being affected by what we know today as a farming boom that happened in the 1950s. Obviously, after the end of World War II, the government had lost its need to subsidize farmers. It lost the need to request grain and request supplies from these farmers. So in a sense, while the farmers did lose a customer, they also found the ability to produce and sell their own product at a higher price. So farming in the 1950s was, at least in this area, somewhat of a boom time for them. Now, with that being said, and like I said before, they did lose one of their main suppliers or one of their main buyers. So the United States military actually worked to buy a lot of the grain, buy a lot of the fruits of these farmers' labors during the Second World War. After all, the age-old adage is true that an army marches on its stomach. And if you can't feed your army is not going to go very far. So looking back and seeing what was happening during the Second World War and seeing the sheer amount of supplies that had to be sent overseas, both in the European theater and the Pacific theater, you can understand that the farmers, not only here in California, but all across the United States, were sending a good deal of what they were producing overseas to the soldiers. With that being gone, it both gave them an opportunity to expand their farms, to look into selling commercially all of their products. And it also gave them an opportunity to build up their farms. They were able to ask more money for these products that they were sending out than they would have had to ask to the United States government. Now, in these pictures, these are actually pictures of French Valley in the 1950s. And you can see in the top left-hand corner there, some cranes in the distance. That's because during this time, you also had a boom in infrastructure. And we will be talking about that in the next slide. But also, things, for as much as things were changing around the world, things were staying pretty much the same as well, at least here in this little community. You still had the family farm, you still had family complexes, you still had a dynamic dry farming community here. And as the world revolved around the things happening with the Soviet Union, the things happening in the Pacific, the things happening all around the world, even the things happening in Washington, D.C. and in the South, things in French Valley did stay the same, at least on the outside. It was what was happening internally with the people, how they were thinking, what they were saying. Those are the things that really changed in the 1950s. And as the 50s went on and President Eisenhower came into power, another thing dramatically changed the dynamic of how the 1950s would change French Valley. And that would be President Eisenhower's grasp of infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure in the United States, especially in areas that maybe didn't have a paved road going through there, or at least if the road was paved, it wasn't a main road, it couldn't handle traffic. So when Eisenhower was brought into office, he completely changed American infrastructure. Now, to understand how President Eisenhower changed infrastructure for the United States, one needs to understand that he was able to see something very profound both in the First World War and Second World War. And that was that he saw a nation, in this case Germany, attempting to fight a war on two fronts. He saw that once a second front opened up on the other side of Germany, the Germans had a hard time moving their soldiers from one side of the country to the other in a very fast and orderly manner. Now, this goes back all the way to the First World War, the first time Germany was forced to fight a two-front war. And Ike, who was then a lieutenant colonel in the US military, accompanied General Pershing on what was then known as the Lincoln Highway March in 1919. What they attempted to do was what the Germans had to do during the First World War. They attempted to move an army contingent from one side of the country to the other. Now you can see in the top left-hand picture and the center bottom picture examples of Pershing's march from one side of the country to the other. Now, the top left-hand picture pretty much sums up the march and the experience that General Pershing and his soldiers had. They found that the so-called Lincoln Highway, which was a series of roads just connected haphazardly, was not really made for travel. It was not really a viable solution of moving the American military from one side of the country to the other. General Pershing was adamant that something had to be done. And remember, this was in 1919, so this isn't even anywhere near the 1950s yet. Process for getting a new highway constructed or some type of grid in the United States was slow coming up until the administration of President Eisenhower. It was during the Eisenhower administration that the US Department of Transportation established the Federal Highway Administration. It was also during this time that most of the highways were planned. Now, keyword there is planned. They were not all built in the 1950s. And in fact, the highway that would connect French Valley, Marietta, and Temecula with the rest of California wouldn't end up being built through this area until the late 1970s to early 1980s, which we're going to touch on that later. But you can see the advancement. You can see that with the institution of a general highway of going from one side of the country to the other side of the country, it's going to bring about a lot of business, especially to little far off places that before you would have to know exactly where you're going. You would have to set out to try to come to French Valley. It wouldn't necessarily be something that you would just drive through on a Sunday drive or what have you. But now with the institution of highways, it brought business, it brought travelers, and it brought a well-needed boom to the local economy. Now, with that being said, we did have Highway 395 here at the time, and that was something that was bringing in traffic. And I like to use the word traffic because traffic doesn't necessarily mean it was bringing in tons and tons of people. It was bringing in just enough people to keep the farmers and the dairy and everything like that in the valley afloat, just enough, essentially. What you see on your screen now is pictures of the highways being constructed there. That bottom left-hand picture right there is from Los Angeles, actually. And then the upper right-hand corner is the institution of the traffic jam. That would come in the 1950s as well. This is a part of 395, which is essentially what I was just talking about, of 395 heading up through Temecula. You can see that on your upper right-hand corner of your screen there. And then the two other pictures on the left and the center of your screen show sections of 395 during this time and showing the type of businesses that sprang up along that route. Obviously, with the introduction of a highway, with the introduction of a freeway system, you now had businesses that sprung up to accommodate that highway and freeway system. So we're talking about bigger gas stations, more car-friendly attractions. Obviously, we all know of the drive-in, which made its debut in the 1930s and 40s and then really hit it off in the 1950s. But those type of institutions, they could be found all over Southern California and all over, not necessarily French Valley, but the Temecula Valley area. So it brought a lot of people in. Obviously, people were traveling in the 1950s. As we talked about earlier, there was ample amounts of money. There was higher wages on average that were coming out of factories, that were coming out of businesses and what have you. And people were itching to use it, essentially. The upper left-hand corner of your screen, that picture right there, that is a very familiar intersection to anybody who's traveled 395 headed south out of Temecula. And that is taken in 1950s. And you can see the amount of cars on the road, even at that point. People enjoyed traveling. As I said before, most people in the United States saw this as a golden age. So the institution of traveling, the prospect of going somewhere, of taking the family on a road trip, of having the money to be able to do that in a brand new car that looked completely different from anything else that you've had before. Those were types of things that brought business not only to the major cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, but also everywhere in between, including French Valley. Now, as we move on through the decades, we're going to be talking about the 1960s next. But one last note that I'd like to say on the highway system and the construction of the freeway system in the United States is that for the dry farmers here in French Valley, it did bring about an increase in traffic. It brought about an increase in profit for the people heading through. They'd want to stop at the little gas stations. They'd want to stop at the markets and what have you. However, it also gave the dry farmers here an opportunity, and that opportunity was to leave. Now, throughout this entire history series, we've been talking about the growth of French Valley, how French Valley would become a haven for these dry farmers. They would obviously come from France and end up landing here, finding themselves in California just after the American Civil War. And in the 1950s, we now see a change in a lot of their priorities. Obviously, with industrialization after the end of the Second World War, you have a lot of people who are now looking at different prospects than farming. Obviously, with the introduction of better wages, of higher employment rate, cities are growing. Obviously, with the construction of highways, you can get places easier now. So a lot of people saw it as a reason that if they were not happy farming in French Valley, they could leave. And starting at the end of the 1950s, we see a drastic change in population in not only French Valley, but in Temecula and Marietta as well, in this whole region, where farmers would actually leave to go to cities, to go to different places. They would head north into Northern California, into the Central Valley region. So while the highway system was good in one regards, it was also bad in other aspects. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward, which we are now going to go ahead and move forward into the 1960s. So this section is titled Peace and Love in the Valley. And of course, you cannot talk about the 1960s without talking about the hippie movement, the love versus war movement, as you see in the lower left-hand picture of your screen right there. And while the hippie movement was something that was known about at the time, it was something that, from my research, a lot of the French Valley youth did want to get involved in. They liked the idea of the hippies. They liked the idea of the style and the fashion. It just simply wasn't necessarily something that caught on here in the Valley. You have to remember that a lot of the people who were living in the Valley, a lot of the farmers, a lot of the older families living here, they were very conservative in their thinking. So this new hippie movement, while it might have been tantalizing for the younger folk, it wasn't necessarily something that they would approve of. It wasn't necessarily something that would have caught on. So just keep that in mind, that there probably were hippies here in French Valley, but obviously not as many as you might find in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, and what have you. But the hippie movement in the United States did influence French Valley. It definitely influenced the way people dressed, the way people thought. You had a younger generation that was coming of age just after the generation that had fought in the Second World War. So there was a lot of changes going on. And those changes did happen, as we've been talking about, in the 1950s, on a big scale and a small scale. And no matter what scale it was on, it did affect French Valley. Obviously, in the pictures you see on your screen, we have civil rights continuing. We have civil rights, if anything, growing in strength. You have the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of Malcolm X, of the major civil rights actions that were taken in the American South and in Washington, D.C. at the time. You have the assassination of the United States President, John F. Kennedy. So, and you also have things going on around the world, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have the increasing intentions of the Cold War. We also have environmental conservation. That became a major thing in the 1960s. People stepped back and looked and saw what we had done to ourselves in the Second World War and in the 1950s and said enough is enough. So all of these things did affect French Valley in a very profound way. The most influential thing for this valley was actually environmental conservation, because of course, for farmers, they're living off the land, they're living from the fruits of the earth. So if those fruits are being put in danger, if they are dying out, if crops are failing, it's going to affect them before it affects any of us. So environmental conservation, while it wasn't on everybody's radar here in the valley, it was one of those things that really did affect everybody living here. Not only the young generation, but the older generation as well. Everybody was on board with attempting to mitigate the line between development and just making sure that you'll have food to put on the table, not only for you, but for everybody else who buys their products wherever their products are sent. So the area does have a very long history of environmental conservation. But at the same time, talking about developments, we have other things happening. And those things are that with the introduction of the highway system, with the introduction of the freeway system, and like I said, it wouldn't necessarily be here yet, but it would be inching its way closer to the Temecula Valley region. We had these projections of the amount of populace that would be here in the valley in the coming years. And what we did in the 1960s in this area is that we actually moved to make it so that when the populace came, we were ready. And when I say we, I'm of course talking about we as a whole, as a community. And that means that bigger buildings were being built. You see a picture here of a building that's going up. I'm not exactly sure where that is. I couldn't find any research on that, but that's a picture of a building being put up in the nearby area. We have talks about putting in an airport, a municipal airport that would go on to become F-70, French Valley Airport, which is located just to the south of this library. And we also have propositions put forward for a lake to be built in Auld Valley, a reservoir, so that the local area could have enough water to drink and that it would support a population boom that they were almost sure would come. Now, again, this is the 1960s, so these are things that are just either being put together at the time as the building is, or things that are being projected. So it's not a guarantee necessarily, but it's something that when you look at it from a perspective of hindsight, us looking back from 2022 back to the 1960s, we can say, oh, well, of course they would put that in, you know? But at the time, obviously these things were still up in the air. We weren't sure if we necessarily needed a reservoir. Do we necessarily need an airport in the area? Do you think that the increase in traffic from the highway that's coming through, Highway 395, or the increase in traffic and trucks coming through and the freeway system, obviously being Interstate 15 and the 215 as well, would that be enough to justify it? It ended up being enough, but at the time in the 1960s, for the farmers and the young people who were living in the valley, this must have seemed like a total upheaval of what they were used to, what they had grown up with. And of course, that attitude continued into the 1970s and 1980s. Now, this picture here is one that is very interesting, and it's one of those few photographs that really shows a change in the valley from a very relatively recent time. This is the opening of the Lake Skinner filtration plant in 1976. And a lot of the people in this picture are actually French Valley natives. They're French Valley residents. These are the families who the roads are named after, the Alds, the Burrells. They really ended up making a name for themselves in not only preserving what they had done for so many generations, but moving forward. The building of a reservoir that not only would serve the French Valley region, but would also serve all of the regions around it. Now, again, we've been talking about highways the entire time, and to some people, watching the highways come is somewhat like watching paint dry, simply because it took the highways so long to get here. And while it took a long time, obviously, it ended up being beneficial, but as we see in these pictures, the highways were still being constructed. Again, these are programs that were started in the 1950s. So it would obviously take some time, but as they inch closer and closer and closer into the region, which eventually they would reach our region and pass through it in the late 1980s, they brought with them immense amounts of people, immense amounts of money in the form of just tourists traveling, people looking to settle down in a new area. And yeah, so we finally reached the point where the interstate and the highway has reached French Valley. So now you're going to see a major boom in population starting in the late 1980s. And to accommodate that boom in population, Lake Skinner is finally completed. Lake Skinner would be completed in the late 1970s, actually, is when Lake Skinner would be completed. And it would be completed over an area that was once known as Auld Valley. So the Auld Road, of course, led to where the family had their farm. The family owned not just the valley, but area beyond it as well. But obviously a large portion of that area was bought by the municipal water district and turned into the Lake Skinner Reservoir, which you can still visit today, and is actually the location of the Alamo Schoolhouse, which we're going to touch on in the next slide right here. But this is a picture of the Auld family. Again, it's good to know always where you've come from, the land that you're on, where that land came from, who owned it before. So whenever you go to Lake Skinner, realize that these are the people who owned it before it was Lake Skinner, before it was a reservoir. It was a farm, and it was farmed by these very stout, very, very strong individuals, very strong immigrant family that came from France. Now, talking about Alamo Schoolhouse, this holds a very special place in my heart and the heart of the French Valley Historical Society, as most of the Historical Society actually were attendees of the Alamo Schoolhouse, and these pictures come from them. For many communities, a schoolhouse is very, very important because it's where the community comes together at a very young age to know one another, to grow in bonds of friendship, in family. And the Alamo Schoolhouse, something that for a very long time, it was unsure of whether or not it would actually be saved or not. And thankfully in 1997, it was saved and moved to Lake Skinner. But it's very important to know where you've come from. And it's very important to see that those things are preserved. And thankfully for us, the Alamo Schoolhouse is preserved. And as I said, it is actually still there at Lake Skinner. You can go and visit the schoolhouse, you can see it. And if you do that, think back to the other segments of this history program and understand that for the immigrant families who came here, for the smaller children who may not necessarily have realized what was going on in the world when they arrived in this strange area to set up farms and spoke to people who didn't speak their language and saw their brothers and fathers and sisters go off to fight in foreign lands over in Europe, some of which never returned. Understand that the schoolhouse, there's a lot of history in it. There's a lot of history, not only in the elders who built it and the elders who taught there, but in the young people who would be brought up in it and who would go on to want to preserve it and who would go on to see the valley change in very profound and tremendous ways. So just a side note, if you do end up visiting the Alamo Schoolhouse at Lake Skinner, do pay respects and try to understand the amount of history that can be contained in what is essentially a one-room building. It's quite astounding. Now, moving on to other things that a lot of you might understand are here now and might even go and utilize them, is F70, which is the FAA designation for the French Valley Airport. The airport began construction in 1987 and it opened officially in 1989. So it is a relatively new airport. Currently, if you go by the airport, you'll see that they are constructing buildings on the opposite side. So if you're looking at this picture on your screen right now, it would be on the left side of that fence right there. They're going to be constructing some new commercial property there. But the airport is actually very busy. F-70 has had hundreds of thousands of aircraft come by in its existence. And daily there are flights in and out of the airport that are either connecting somewhere or just joy flights going out and flying around the Temecula Valley. They have a wonderful cafe. They have a wonderful camaraderie there among the pilots. Obviously, if you've seen the other segments of French Valley history, you'll know that aviation is very important in this area. We started off as barnstormers, and then now, of course, we have such institutions as the March Reserve Field to our north. We have Camp Pendleton just across the mountains you see on your screen. So aviation has always been very important in this area, and aviation will continue to be important as French Valley Airport continues to expand and continues to push the boundaries of what it was originally designed for. It certainly has influenced the building of this library. If you've ever been to the French Valley Public Library, you'll know that our theme is aviation. So if you go ahead and decide to give us a visit, look out for all of the murals of aircraft on our wall and our model of a Corsair that's hanging in our community room. And of course, this is just what I was touching on of the history of barnstorming. On screen right now, on the left-hand side of your screen is a picture of March Air Force Base. That was shortly after it was changed to March Air Force Base from previously being known as Alessandro Field. Of course, if you want more history on that, please watch the second part of this history series where we go in depth and look at the importance of March Air Force Base in relevance to the First World War and Second World War. And of course, we went from barnstormers, as you see on the bottom of the screen right there, up to the military aircraft that you see, so still biplanes and whatnot. And then if you go on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the types of aircraft that you'll see now if you go to March Air Force Base, which are B-52 bombers, stratotankers, fighter jets, and the like. Now moving on to the 1990s and going back to a discussion of what we were having in the 1950s, up until the Soviet Union fell on December 25th, 1991, the world was still very much held in suspense of what the Soviets would do. And if you remember back to when we were talking about bomb drills and whatnot happening in the 1950s and that tremendously affecting the young people of French Valley during that time, this was kind of a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. Obviously, the fear that the agricultural centers, that these dry farmers who had been there for so long could lose everything in a split second to a foreign adversary was largely gone. The dissolving of the Soviet Union alleviated a lot of fears, not only in French Valley, but of course around the world. And it was a very tremendous event that had lasting issues and continues to have lasting issues even till today. So, of course, we did want to touch on that. And we also want to touch on what rural life was like in the 1990s. Now, if you remember what I was talking about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you'll know that the farming community was in decline, obviously. We had environmental conservation was a movement in the 1960s and 1970s and 80s. But even before that, with the introduction of the highway and interstate system, you had a lot of farmers moving away. Now, in the 1990s, all of this compounded into, in effect, farming was not necessarily eradicated from the valley, but it was in a steep decline. Farmers had to jump through many more hoops now to actually produce their goods and to make sure that they had enough crop to send to market, to feed their own families, to do all of these things. And they had to do it under strict regulations as well. They also had different technologies. So you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, the watering machine right there that can actually go in circles around a crop and water it. So that was good in a sense that the farmers may not have to pay as much for hired hands to do it, But at the same time, there were still many farmers that would end up leaving the valley even in the 1990s. Now, this is a picture of the 1993 flood, which if you are a resident of Temecula and Marietta, in that year, you'll remember the flood quite well, as that was the year that the banks of the Santa Margarita River actually overflowed into Temecula. And it was also the year that we began construction on the Santa Margarita River bed in Temecula. But it affected French Valley as well in the fact that many crops did get flooded. Many roads were completely washed out, as you'll see on your screen. And while we now will look and see rain on the forecast and think that we are actually getting rain because it is very sorely needed, as we are in a major drought at the moment. But for the time, this was devastating. It completely flooded out crops. It killed many of the remaining farms here in the valley, and it destroyed crucial infrastructure in the valley. So the flood of 1993, while it wasn't necessarily the nail in the coffin for everybody, it was kind of a sign of the times that for the farmers who remained, it was going to be rough. Obviously, you had a massive population who was coming in. You had a lot of programs and a lot of buildings going up and stuff. And a lot of that farmland that was once beautiful open plains was now being taken up by commercial housing or even commercial shops, retail centers, and stuff like that. It's interesting to note that the population boom from 1950 to where we are now, which would be the late 1990s to 2000s, in this point in the presentation, was dramatic. This is a count of the Temecula, Winchester, and Marietta areas. So this is not one of those areas in particular. This is all of those areas combined. And this is data taken from the US Census Bureau to show that in 1950, there was just 11,000 people here in this area. By the time 2000 rolled around, that number skyrocketed to 234,000 people, and it continues to skyrocket even today. So a lot of things changed from 1950 to 2000. We can't necessarily say that it was much more profound than the time period between, of course, 1870 all the way up to 1950 in the last two presentations we've done. But it was very different in the sense that the technology, the ideology, the social, the economic, the global problems had changed, and they had affected French Valley in very different ways. But of course, even with the population boom, the original residents still held on. Throughout this entire production, we have been in contact with the French Valley Historical Society, and we've been graced with their photographs, with their stories, with their interviews. And looking ahead, we actually hope to bring that all to you in digital and physical format as well, in the form of an archive. We're not exactly sure when that will be completed necessarily, but we're hoping that it will be very soon. And we're hoping that we can bring you more in-depth looks at different aspects of French Valley life, whether that be the farming community, the veteran community during World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And we are looking forward to bringing you pictures, artifacts, everything you can imagine. So please stay tuned. We will give you any information we know going forward. And thank you for watching this history program. If you've been with us through all three history programs, thank you very much. If you all are looking forward to seeing the archive, please let us know. You can always fill out a comment card here in the library, and feel free to come in and talk to us. We'd love to talk to all of you. Thank you all for watching. We hope you have a very good day. And always remember that the area that you're in, French Valley, was settled a long time ago. Those people are still here, and they are very happy to see all the improvements, all of the changes, and they are still here. Thank you very much.